Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the return of our occasional series with Robert Saunders, Now and Then, in which we look at significant political anniversaries. Today's anniversary is 10 years on from the Brexit referendum. We are going to be trying to decide why the referendum was called, how it was won and how it was lost, and why it plunged British politics into complete chaos. And we start with the question of whether 10 years is just too soon to be having this conversation. Robert, I'm very conscious that the anniversaries that we've discussed with you in this series have been clearly historical in the sense that the general strike was 100 years ago. The Iron Curtain speech was 80 years ago. Even Neil Kinnock taking on Militant 40 years ago. This one is 10 years ago. So this is definitely the most recent. But it's not just that it's recent. It's not even that it's raw. It clearly is raw. It's almost throbbing. It pulses through contemporary British politics, and indeed not just British politics. And yet we are going to be talking about it in a historical framework. Is it possible? My opening question is it possible to do history 10 years on about an event that is not just as recent, but as live as this one?
I think that's the challenge of contemporary history. It is difficult, but we should try. Firstly, because what we're talking about clearly is of historic importance. Brexit brings to an end an entire phase of British history. Before 2016, there is roughly half a century in which the settled policy of every government, Labour or Conservative, is to be part of the European Community, European Union. Over that period, it changes how Britain is governed, how its laws are made, where people go on a holiday, what kind of food they eat, who they trade with. It rewrites Britain's social legislation, its labour laws, its environmental legislation. So in all kinds of ways, this shapes British history. And the decision to bring that period to an end in 2016 is taken against the advice of the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the TUC, the CBI, David Beckham, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So whatever we think of the outcome, it's an extraordinary democratic moment. And I think it would be strange if we didn't try to bring the disciplines of history to that. But you're right that it's clearly difficult, because the same things that make it exciting and magnetic also cloud our judgment. Passions are, as you say, still extraordinarily high. And of course, those of us who write about Brexit almost certainly have strong views about Brexit. So we don't stand outside this in the way that we might for the general strike or home rule or some of the other questions that we've discussed. I think it's also quite a hard topic to pin down, because Brexit has this incredible gravitational pull. It's like a kind of collapsing star that pulls into it so many other big issues and controversies. So it becomes about histories of immigration, histories of social class, histories of democracy, perhaps histories of empire. But I think we should try, first of all, because actually we have here a set of academic disciplines that we can bring to something that was very confusing and in some ways very disorientating. And it's a kind of test of the historical art, in a sense, to see whether we can apply those things to something that we care about. And I think also, without wanting to sound too pious, there is perhaps a sense in which history might be helpful to us when we're living through very divisive and disruptive events. Because historians spend a lot of time trying to think themselves into the minds of people who think differently to themselves. We try to expand our understanding. We try to understand how people could own or sell slaves, how they could vote for fascist parties, how they could burn witches, things that are manifestly much worse than a vote either to leave or remain. And one of the worst legacies of Brexit was a kind of gulf of understanding between leavers and remainers. And there is perhaps a hope that the historical art can help us to see with other people's eyes.
So I'm going to say something against that, which makes me a little wary. I agree we need to try and understand it. I'm a little wary of academic history as the way in. And I think it's partly because I was scarred during the referendum itself by the role as an academic, I'm not sure if I count as a historian or not, seeing how historians weighed in. So I went to an event that was organised in number 11 Downing Street by George Osborne and people around George Osborne. And I think it was called Historians Against Brexit. Like I say, I'm not sure I'm a historian, and my political views were quite obscure, even to me, actually. But I went along out of curiosity. And it was one of the moments, I had a few during the run up to the referendum, when I thought, I think Brexit might win this, because the mood in the room was so complacent, self-indulgent, preaching to the converted. Here were all these historians telling other historians that they understood better the overall trajectory of this. They could see the deeper causes, and they all happened to be Remainers. And I thought if anyone outside this room could see in this room, I think they would have good reason to vote leave, just to shut these people up or to put a pin in their little bubble of self-regard. In the same way, inside a university, as I was at the time, Cambridge University, which issued a statement, I think it was the heads of the colleges, which said, as people who have a longer perspective than ordinary people, we want to tell you that you should vote to remain. And also, by the way, if you vote to leave, it would be very bad for universities. So we are an interest group, and we also are patronising. And I'm just a little nervous that academic history is too caught up in this stuff. Certainly it was at the time. To have that, we can take a step back and help with understanding. That's my reservation here.
I think that's an entirely fair critique. I don't think that academics generally, or historians in particular, covered themselves with glory during the Brexit period or in the 3 years that followed the referendum. I think there was, particularly in the period after the referendum, actually, there was an extraordinary period in which academics kind of turned themselves into quack doctors who sort of marched around the psychiatric unit, diagnosing all kinds of disorders and insanities among the general public, that this was imperial nostalgia, or it was post-colonial melancholia, or it was some other kind of, not just misjudgment, but kind of mental failing and blindness. So actually, I think the other side of trying to do academic history on Brexit has to be self-critical. It has to be actually about what did we get wrong and what did we do wrong. Most academics, including me, didn't just back Remain. We actually predicted the result wrongly. Most of us thought that Remain would win. And I think that raises questions actually about how well we understood the country that we write about. What histories hadn't we been writing or thinking about? So part of the point of doing it is actually a kind of self-correction. I think perhaps the other case I would make is that whether we like it or not, people are already telling the history of Brexit. People make claims about that period that have power in the present. So when somebody says Parliament blocked Brexit, or the Northern Ireland Protocol was negotiated under duress, or the Leave vote was driven by exceptionalism, they are making claims about the past that justify certain kinds of politics and action in the present. And I think it would be strange if academic historians just stood entirely outside that argument.
One more question about the recent nature of these events before we get on to trying to, if not explain them, I'm not sure explain is the right word, but explore their dynamic, which is the two tribes who are still the two tribes of British politics. They're called Leavers and Remainers. That tends to be how they're characterised. And I've read in the last couple of months all sorts of diagnoses of the current state of British politics, which say it looks like it's all in flux, all of these new parties have arisen. But actually, when you break it down, it's still tribal, and there are two tribes. They're not the party tribes. They're the Leavers and the Remainers. And that's the way to explain it. But those labels are in some ways post hoc labels. They are describing something about British politics now, and they have to use that awful phrase, but it is useful for contemporary politics. They're more of a vibe analysis than they are a historical account of what was formed in 2016. And there are lots of examples. For instance, most people think of Liz Truss as being a classic Leave person in vibe terms, and Rishi Sunak was contrasted with her as a Remainer. Yet Rishi Sunak was the one who advocated leaving the European Union, and Liz Truss at that point was sucking up to the government and reluctantly, maybe or maybe not, was a Remainer. So there is also a danger, I think, that some of the labels are labels from now that we think have their point of origin then. And actually, the history of this period is not the history of 2016. It has to be the history of the whole 10 years, which is what we're going to try and do here.
Yes, we tend to forget that, as you say, those identities, Leavers and Remainers, that became so powerful after 2016 really emerged in the wake of the referendum rather than in the run-up to it. And that's actually an example of where history can be a corrective to the way in which we tend to think about our current politics. It is useful to be reminded, as you say, that Liz Truss voted Remain in 2016 and that Rishi Sunak was a Brexiteer. So that's perhaps an example of where history can be quite helpful in challenging the way that we talk about politics in the present and understanding how we got to that point.
Right. So, having criticised historians for being too self-indulgent, enough of the self-indulgent chat about the historiography. Let's do the event itself. Try and break it down into different kinds of questions that people have about it. And I think the first one, which again, it's really raw in contemporary British politics, the question of why the referendum was called. Not the result, but why it happened. And there are lots of mooted explanations for that, and they range from being quite specific and narrow to very broad and structural. But I am struck by how often it is taken for granted, I have to say, particularly by people who, let's call them Remainers, assume that the explanation for why the referendum took place is that, this is the phrase that's often used, it was a piece of party management by David Cameron. What they want to do is contrast, in a way, the small stakes of what was going through Cameron's mind as he tried to see off a faction of his party, spike the guns of UKIP, play electoral politics, and the vast scale of what resulted. There's an assumption there's a mismatch here. It had causes which were, in their triviality almost, in the sweep of things, out of proportion with the outcome. Now, I'm not sure about that, and I don't think it's a very convincing explanation. I think big things tend to have big causes on the whole. But do you think there's anything to it? The phrase, "it was party management by David Cameron," does that cut it in any sense?
I think elections and referendums are interesting, partly because they're kind of moments where structure and agency meet. They're moments at which conscious political actors make choices, but they do so in response to a set of conditions that they themselves have not created. And 2016 is an interesting example of that. So I think we probably do have to start with David Cameron. He is the kind of Gavrilo Princip of this story, the gunman in Sarajevo in 1914 who accidentally starts the First World War. Because David Cameron calls that referendum without consulting the cabinet. He goes against the advice of his two closest ministers, George Osborne and Michael Gove, both of whom tell him not to do this. So it is a war of choice. And there are perhaps two theories as to why he does it. So the first, as you say, is the kind of simple Tory story. It's about managing a crisis in the Conservative Party. He's dealing with rising Euroscepticism on his own backbenches. He's facing a challenger party on the right from the UK Independence Party. So he gambles and calls the referendum essentially to give his backbenchers what they want. His own version of the story, I think, is more interesting and is worth taking seriously. So his version is that Britain was essentially on a kind of conveyor belt that was leading to Brexit for years before 2016. Democratic consent was becoming paper thin. The EU itself was changing in ways that were making it potentially more dangerous to things like the City of London. Parties themselves kept promising referendums that they didn't deliver. And that actually the best way to keep Britain in the European Union was to do what Harold Wilson had done in 1975, or to do what he himself had done in Scotland in 2014, which is to grip the issue, to bring the crisis forward, negotiate a new package of terms of membership, and then fight a referendum under a prime minister who actually wanted Britain to stay inside. So in this version, Cameron is a man who's plunging his arms into the spokes of history and trying to wrench the wheel in a different direction. And I think there clearly is something in both of those stories. There are all sorts of long-term structural problems here to which Cameron is trying to respond. But he does have other options. He could, for example, have done what he did over gay marriage, or to some extent over environmental policy. He could have challenged Euroscepticism in his own party. The fact that he doesn't do that tells us something about Cameron as a politician, but also about the kind of political culture in which he's operating.
There's one highly contingent version of the first of those two options, the more party management one, which is that Cameron didn't think he would win a majority in the 2015 election. So this was a manifesto commitment. It was a manifesto commitment on which he fought the 2015 election, and he won a majority. And so he could say, having promised it in the manifesto, if we're going to maintain trust in politics, we have to deliver what we said we'd deliver. But some people suggest that he thought that the coalition government would continue, in that he was expecting to remain prime minister, but not to be able to form a majority in the Commons. And the price of a renewed coalition deal would have been to drop that manifesto commitment. It could have been traded away. The Liberal Democrats would have been unlikely to agree to join a government. We don't know, of course, but unlikely to agree to join a government that called a referendum on Europe. So there is an even more contingent version of it that way. But on the structural side, so I want to ask you about that word consent, which is also sometimes raised. And I say this more often comes from people who were in favour of Brexit, but it cuts across that divide, which is there was a consent issue, and it does go back to the 1975 referendum. The 1975 referendum secured consent for Britain's membership of an international organisation which had changed out of all recognition over the following 40 years, and in particular the creation of the euro. Not just that, but now Britain was part of a European Union in which the vast majority of member states were Euro states. Britain was not, and there was almost no question of it becoming one. And therefore, something had to be done to secure continuing consent to that arrangement, and that maybe a referendum was the only way to do it. And I have some sympathy with that. I feel that there had been a referendum on this question, but it was asking a different question because the organisation had changed so much. And given that in the first instance consent was secured through a referendum, it is very hard to see what other device was available to secure consent to these new arrangements.
I think it's absolutely fair to say that the question that was being asked in 2016 and being pushed in the years before it was fundamentally different to the question that had been asked in 1975. What had once been a community of 9 had turned into a union of 28. It had developed competencies in home affairs, security policy. It had an anthem, it had a flag, it had something that looked very like a constitution, even if it wasn't actually called a constitution. Now, of course, you could make a similar argument actually about the British state. In all sorts of ways, the British state looked very different in 2016 to in the early 1970s. But you have a kind of continuing process of the regeneration of consent over that 40 years through the domestic political cycle. And I think it was reasonable to say that that hadn't really happened in the interim. It's also true that parties hadn't really made much of an attempt to maintain consent. One of the paradoxes here is that, as I said earlier, every government, whether Labour or Conservative, since the early 1960s, had believed that Britain should be inside this European entity. Almost none of them, after 1975, actually made that argument to the public. It was always much easier to play a kind of George and the Dragon role, in which you, as the British government, are nobly defending the British people from this danger that stands outside its borders. And that was a role that was played not just by Eurosceptics, and David Cameron always called himself a Eurosceptic, but also by actively pro-European politicians like Tony Blair.
We're going to come on to how the public thought about this and how the public voted on this. But there's another version of the explanation for the decision to call the referendum itself, which is a sort of hybrid of the things that we've been talking about, but I feel it's slightly different. The thing that makes me want to discuss it is the excellent recent book by Tom McTague called Between the Waves, which told the prehistory of 2016 right the way back to 1945. And not just the story of Britain's politicians and their relationship to Europe, but the thinkers, the intellectuals, some historians, but others too, but also the people who are the circle outside the inner circle of British politics, in the think tanks, the people who are maybe being funded to run campaigns. That strain of Euroscepticism that really got going after 1975, it was generational. It had been running for a generation. And when Cameron says Britain was on a conveyor belt to Brexit, I don't think we know that in relation to public opinion. And the vote was, after all, very close. It's hard to tell a deterministic story in which the British people were going to demand this, come what may. But there were people not just within the Conservative Party, but outside the Conservative Party, on the other side of the divide, some of them were on the left of British politics, who were passionately committed to forcing this issue. And there is a question in politics about whether, in the end, the thing that is most valuable is stamina. I mean, just the ability to keep hammering away. And the hammering away had been happening for a generation. And I have a feeling that it had worn the establishment down in a way. So there was a desire to lance this boil, which wasn't simply to manage electoral politics in 2015, 2016, but finally almost to call the bluff of the people who'd been making life hell, essentially, for elected politicians, at least since the 1990s. And Cameron, very different politician from John Major, and John Major was a committed Remainer and wouldn't have considered such a referendum. But John Major's life was made hell by this, and Cameron's was in some ways too. And maybe there's a feeling that in the end, if you have those people buzzing around for a generation, they'll get their way almost by default. And there was something of that going on in 2016.
Yes, politics isn't just about numbers, it's about energy and commitment. And there was clearly a disparity of commitment on this question. One of the big failings of the pro-European side, if we can even call it that, is that in the 30 years or so before 2016, it tended to assume that the question was closed, that you didn't actually need to talk about this anymore. Whereas those who wanted to leave were out there, they were building organisations, they were making arguments, they were setting up networks, they were testing their arguments in the public, so that when the referendum actually came, they had grassroots organisations, they knew what kinds of arguments were going to work, they were used to operating outside the party system. Whereas there was a sense in 2016 that pro-Europeans couldn't quite remember why they were pro-European, except insofar as they didn't like Nigel Farage or Bill Cash. And we see that disparity in all the sorts of areas that you were talking about. But we also see it in things like party leadership contests. Just to give an example, Ken Clarke could not become leader of the Conservative Party in the 90s and 2000s because the Eurosceptics in his party would not have him. He was clearly more electorally saleable than somebody like William Hague or Ian Duncan Smith, but there was a red line here that they were not willing to cross. By contrast, the Labour Party, which is an overwhelmingly pro-Remain party, in 2015 elected a lifelong Eurosceptic as its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we can go on to talk about what the effect of that might have been, but I think it's a telling illustration that Corbyn made no secret of his long history as a Eurosceptic. That didn't matter when choosing a leader in the year before a referendum. It didn't stop the party members putting him back again in the aftermath of that referendum, when membership was now the biggest question in British politics. So there's always been a sense that the Eurosceptic side of the argument was willing to subordinate everything else to this, whereas the pro-European side was willing to subordinate almost nothing to it.
One last thing on this theme. We touched on this when we talked about the 1975 referendum, and you mentioned it earlier, Harold Wilson's own thought processes. And at the heart of that story was the question of renegotiation. And there was an attempted renegotiation in this case too by Cameron. So there is somewhere in this mix, I think almost certainly, a small part played by the thought that a referendum was a negotiating tactic. It was a thing to hold over the rest of the EU. And that's the bit of brinkmanship to me that seems fundamentally misjudged, in the sense that you might think holding a referendum and the threat to hold a referendum and then going through with it, because no threat has real force unless you're willing to go through with it, was a way of really focusing the rest of the EU on the things that Cameron cared about, which were, among other things, the state of the City of London. There was real anxiety within the Conservative Party about some of the new rules that were going to be introduced, about being outside of the euro when big questions of high finance were being decided. But it doesn't work as a negotiating tactic. And once it's been called, it is fatal as a negotiating tactic, because if the British people vote to stay in, you've used it and it's gone. The threat won't work again. And if they vote to leave, you've left. And that's the bit of it. I think it was wrapped up a little in Cameron's mindset as a negotiator. But actually, I think that's where he maybe got caught.
Bernard Jenkin, who's of course one of the leading Eurosceptics in this story, calls the referendum a bluff call referendum. And that's certainly one way of thinking about this. I actually think that this is one area in which I've changed my mind a little bit. I think Cameron's renegotiation was more substantial than I realised at the time, and actually had a stronger argument behind it. And the argument will, I think, be something like this, that in the years before 2016, Britain had been engaged in a kind of slow Brexit. So from the early 90s onwards, one of the big questions facing successive British governments was, should Britain join new European initiatives in order to try to shape them from the inside, or should it opt out from them? And increasingly the answer had been that Britain should opt out. So it opts out of the euro, it opts out of Schengen. Theresa May opts out of most areas of justice and home affairs cooperation. David Cameron then pulls the Conservatives out of the main centre-right party in the European Parliament. And on one level, that does what it's supposed to do. It puts Britain outside those kinds of initiatives. But it also means that increasingly Britain is not actually in the room when big decisions are being taken. So when the Eurozone crisis hits, the Eurozone member states are doing big things around financial regulation and around kind of support funds and structures that affect Britain, that have consequences for the City of London. But Britain simply isn't in the place where those decisions are being taken. So even some staunch pro-Europeans actually start to argue that Britain is coming to a fork in the road, that its current membership is becoming untenable. And of course, the original meaning of the word crisis is a kind of crossing or a decision point. It is a fork in the road. And Cameron would argue that what he's trying to do in the renegotiation is actually to kind of reconstitute British membership. So you create stronger firewalls against Eurozone legislation. You put Britain outside the legal architecture that moves towards ever closer union. And in that sense, you actually do put British membership on a slightly different foundation. So I think it's true to say that membership actually would have looked different if Britain had voted to stay in 2016. The problem is that renegotiation doesn't do any of the things that Cameron had talked about or that were likely to move the electoral needle. In particular, it does almost nothing on questions like immigration. And because Cameron had to say, if I don't get the renegotiation I want, I am willing to lead the Leave campaign, he had in a sense endorsed the claim that it would be absolutely fine for Britain to leave. And that undermines some of the arguments he made later on about the severe consequences of Brexit.
Right, let's talk about what did move the electoral needle. In other words, let's try and explore the reasons for the result. And again, now, as at the time, and with just as much political charge now as then, all sorts of explanations are mooted and some things are taken for granted. One thing that still gets mentioned a lot is the role of Boris Johnson, the contingency of the role of Boris Johnson. A lot of people are aware that he penned 2 columns, one arguing to stay, one arguing to leave, and there's a thought that on his decision as to which column to publish in the Daily Telegraph, the fate of the nation hung, and that Johnson's coming out for leave, for the Brexit side of this argument, was decisive. Do you think it was? Do you think some of this might turn on individuals and that individual in particular?
I think with any of these factors, we have to remember that we are talking about 17.4 million people who voted to leave. It's the largest electoral coalition ever assembled in British history for anything. And it stretches from Nigel Farage on the right all the way to George Galloway on the left. And there is a bit of a danger that we try to find one totalizing explanation, whereas in some ways what we're really talking about is a series of bricks which, when you put them together, build this electoral wall. Having said that, Johnson clearly is important, and that's why both sides put so much energy into courting him in 2016. He's not the Boris Johnson of 2019 or 2026. He is at this time the twice-elected Mayor of London. He's seen as a liberal, broadly pro-immigration figure. He has, I think, the highest likability ratings of anybody involved in that campaign. And he also, crucially, has the star power to wrest the microphone away from Nigel Farage. And I think it's actually quite important that there are different voices in the Leave campaign at this time. That if you're a classic UKIP voter, if you like Nigel Farage, then you can attach yourself to that part of the campaign. If you don't want to vote with Nigel Farage, the presence of someone like Boris Johnson is very important. It suggests that you can attach yourself to a case for leave, which is liberal, which is tolerant, which is progressive, and which doesn't have the kind of stigma that Middle England in this period in particular still feels around Nigel Farage and UKIP.
And given the size of the coalition, any coalition of that size is going to contain within it people who are appalled by the thought they're in a coalition with the other people in the coalition. If you spread it across and then got 2 representatives from the different wings together, they could easily put each other off. And Johnson does feel like he was the one person who could, slightly pretentious word, but transcend it. I remember talking to people, Gisela Stewart, a leading Labour campaigner for Brexit, who went on the bus with Boris Johnson, and simply being astonished, not just by his star power, but by the range of people who wanted to come and see him, almost touch him, would swarm around him as they got off the bus in these different places. It wasn't just the usual suspects turning out. He did go beyond. And it is hard to think of any other political figure who could do that. My sense of it is not that it was Johnson what won it, but had Johnson not come out for Brexit, it is harder to see how the Leave campaign could have held its coalition together. He is not a sufficient explanation, but he might just be necessary.
Yes, and he makes possible this sort of two-face campaign. I don't mean that in a critical sense, but you have the official Leave campaign, Vote Leave, which is headed by Boris Johnson, Gisela Stuart, and people like that. And then you have Leave EU, which is headed by Nigel Farage and George Galloway and Aaron Banks and people of that kind. And these two campaigns absolutely loathe one another. It is hard to exaggerate how much time those two campaigns spend warring on one another. There are all sorts of extraordinary claims flying around about private detectives being hired, phones being bugged, events being sabotaged. If Leave had lost the referendum, we would all be talking about that as one of the reasons why they lost. Instead, I actually think it's probably one of the reasons why they won, because it stimulated energy, it created a kind of competition. And of course, if this had been a parliamentary election, they would have split the Leave vote between them, and that would have benefited Remain. But because it's a referendum, as long as their supporters all put their cross in the right box, it doesn't really matter how much they hate one another. They're all building this single kind of united electoral force.
So I'm going to go through what are almost the cliched explanations, and then we're going to not dismantle them, but open them up. Probably the commonest relates to the campaign itself. And again, these explanations tend to come from the people who lost. People who lose are keener to know why they lost than people who won are keen to know why they won. People who won are happy just to celebrate and get on with it. On the losing side, there remains a strong sense that the campaign to Leave was duplicitous. It was built on lies. The most notorious examples still cited. It's almost become a shorthand in British politics. The advert on the side of the bus about the money that would be made available on a weekly basis for the NHS. But more broadly, that this was a campaign in which people were sold a false prospectus about what leaving the EU would involve. I think there's some recognition, even from the losers, that it was in many ways a brilliant campaign. It was dynamic, it was innovative, and the campaign to Remain was none of those things. It was pretty tame, actually, and very conventional. And the campaign, directed by Dominic Cummings, for Vote Leave, so not the Aaron Banks, Nigel Farage version, but the mainstream version. Cummings was not with Farage, he was with Johnson and Gisela Stuart, was innovative and unconventional. The people who don't like it, their problem with it is that they think it was full of untruths. Are they right?
I think campaigns do matter, and the campaign tactics were much more effective on one side of the argument than they were on the other. If we take something like the 350 million on the side of the bus, that was designed really to do two things. Firstly, simply to knock the Remain campaign off balance, and that's always been a big part of the kind of Cummings strategy book, that you disorientate your opponents because they're so appalled by this manifestly false claim that they stop talking about what they're meant to be talking about and they move on to that instead. Also, because EU finances are so difficult to explain, the process of trying to say why this was untrue simply meant that very large figures kept being put onto the airwaves about how much Britain was in fact paying. I think the other thing that's worth saying about the Leave campaign is that they just had a lot more experience at the kind of campaigning that they were going to have to do in this referendum. They had tended to work outside the established party system. UKIP, in particular, was principally a non-parliamentary party. It won more than 4 million votes in 2015, but it only won one seat in Parliament. So they're used to this kind of street-fighting, grassroots, what we might call pop-up politics, where a campaign vehicle pops up for a particular purpose and then is dismantled very quickly afterwards. They're well stocked with people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who had made their names as journalists. They know how to make a headline. They know how to tell a story in a way that might not entirely pass the test of truthfulness, but will arrest attention and will frame a particular story in your way. And Dominic Cummings himself was somebody who had cut his teeth, I think, fighting the referendum campaign against the North East Assembly in the 1990s. He had been very active in the AV referendum in 2011. So they knew how to do this kind of politics.
Cummings, for some people, is the Svengali behind all of this. I think we hear less now than we did 2017, 18, 19, that actually this was a campaign that used all of these sinister new techniques that there was micro-targeting, the Cambridge Analytica, that's probably the shorthand for it. There was this new kind of technology that allowed Dominic Cummings and his evil cohort to target individual voters with messages that would press their buttons. I don't hear that explanation so much anymore, though it was pretty prevalent at the time. I think it's wrong. I think the Cambridge Analytica explanation is wrong, just as this was Russian sabotage. I don't think that is helpful in this context. But actually, the ad on the side of the bus is a good illustration of this. That was not new targeted tech politics. It was old-fashioned, an ad on the side of the bus. But my understanding of it is that the research that the Vote Leave campaign had done had shown them that any document that had the NHS logo on it tended to get more attention and a more positive response. So not micro-targeting, targeting the entire British people with a campaign that did use the NHS. And it was a way of simply having the NHS logo on Vote Leave material. In a way, it was quite crude. It was very effective, but it was crude. It was not this new, sinister mind games politics, getting inside people's heads, the beginning of the age of AI and the end of democracy altogether. That campaign could have come from the 1975 referendum. It just was more effective. And part of the reason it was more effective is that it was more experimental. They did try things out, which I'm not sure Vote Leave did. But also probably they were willing to push the envelope a little. I mean, they were less afraid, for the reasons you said, of outraging establishment opinion, because outraging establishment opinion was useful for them. On the other side, there really was none of that. I mean, I think in some ways it's the weakness of the Remain campaign, at least as much as the strengths of the Leave campaign, that provides not a sufficient but a necessary explanation here.
Yeah, I think the Remain campaign is an absolute catastrophe. And in some ways, in retrospect, the surprise is that Remain comes so close to winning that it does actually win 48% of the vote. And I think that partly comes from a particular understanding of politics that dominated Number 10. Cameron and Osborne in particular had a very clear sense of how elections are won, and they based that on a set of very unhelpful analogies, principally the 2015 general election and the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. And the lesson that they drew from that is that economic risk will always trump idealistic commitments to things like sovereignty or independence. When it comes to the crunch, people might want to leave, but they will not vote to make themselves poorer. So the decision they take is essentially to ignore almost all of the things that everybody else is actually talking about. Whereas, as you say, the Leave campaign says, right, people like the NHS, so let's attach the NHS to our campaign. The thinking in the Remain camp is that we will talk only about economic risk. We won't try and challenge the case on immigration. We won't try to make a positive argument on sovereignty in the way that the Remain campaign had done in 1975. If we're not talking about economic risk, then we're talking about the wrong thing. And the problem with that was, first of all, it was extremely boring. And secondly, I think it was quite hard to make it land. Because in 2014, that kind of risk argument had a hook. You could say to Scottish voters, if you vote for independence, then you will lose the pound. In 2015, you could say to voters, if you elect a Labour government, then Ed Miliband will be running the economy. And whatever we or listeners might think about those claims, there is something tangible there. Whereas in 2016, they were having to say, if we leave an organisation that we've spent years telling you is sclerotic and in decline and it will be perfectly fine outside, then GDP might grow by a smaller quantity over a certain event horizon. And that just doesn't have the kind of punch that they had been able to exert in 2014 or 2015.
I want to use a phrase that you used right at the beginning when you said these were the sorts of things that historians were diagnosing, and ask you whether you think there's anything in it. The people who voted to leave, were they nostalgic? So the particular phrase you used was imperial nostalgia. And there was an assumption, again, I think you've got to say it's from Remain historians, diagnosing imperial nostalgia among Leave voters. But was there a sense that the people who voted to leave, do you think, were trying to reclaim or recapture something from Britain's past, whether empire or something else?
I was very sceptical always of the argument about imperial nostalgia. Partly, it's a very convenient argument for the Remain campaign, that there was just some terrible pathology rooted in the pathologies of British history that bent the vote in the wrong direction. The problem with it, first of all, is that some of the most nostalgic figures in British politics. Some of the people who were most likely to talk positively about empire were on the Remain campaign. David Cameron had talked explicitly about admiration for Britain's imperial history. He had revived an imperial form of honour. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had both talked positively about empire. The imperial historian Neil Ferguson was on the Remain campaign. So while it may be true to say that there are all sorts of mental legacies of empire that influence British politics, it's not clear that they're all on one side of the fence here. I think the other problem with the argument is that you could make quite a compelling case that the problem with the Leave campaign was it didn't take empire seriously enough. If you take empire seriously as a factor in British history, then the end of empire must be a rupture point. The options that are open to Britain in the world must be different once the empire is no longer there. But the story that Leavers tended to tell about British history actually wasn't about empire. It was about a small, plucky country that was punching above its weight in the world. It was always about buccaneering Britons. It was about Sir Francis Drake singeing the beards of the Spaniards. It's about Britain standing alone in 1940, not Britain standing alongside 400 million people in one of the biggest military empires the world has ever seen. So, in a way, the problem was imperial amnesia rather than imperial nostalgia in thinking about Britain's options in the world.
And Enoch Powell, who in some respects is the godfather of Euroscepticism, Enoch Powell was one of those people who believed that with the end of empire, one of the temptations for British politics was to go into the European Union, to be in something as big again, try to recreate the scale of empire. Whereas, as you say, for many of the Brexiteers, it's to shrink it back down to the scale of the nation state itself that was the goal of this project. It was for British sovereignty to re-establish itself as the organising principle of British politics. British sovereignty is not the organising principle of the British Empire, because the British Empire is an extremely large and complicated political entity. So I agree with you. It seems that all of that seems confused. So we've talked a lot about the politicians, but the voters, what were they voting for? I mean, was this actually, do you think, for many people who voted in this referendum, not really about membership of the European Union, or the European Union was a proxy for something else? Again, sometimes the explanation that's given is that it was a proxy for questions of immigration. But there's another explanation, which I think is probably got more weight, which is we had already entered post the financial crash the era of anti-politics, the era that we've been in for at least, I would say, 2 decades, in which it's very hard for established parties to secure a consistent hearing. And in an age of anti-politics, confronted with the establishment united en masse, this was an anti-political vote.
One of the dangers of any kind of referendum is that you can decide what question you write on the ballot paper, but you can't decide what question voters actually choose to answer. And there is nothing wrong with that. Elections and referendums do become places in which people bring different kinds of concerns and controversies. So again, if we're trying to understand how you get a block of 17.5 or 16.5 million people, it's always going to be a collection of different issues. So Leave voters, some of them are voting about immigration. Some of them are voting against their established political leaders. Some of them are protesting against austerity. For some of them, it's about a sort of demand for respect from a political class that they see as being disrespectful to them. And actually, one of the successes, I think, of the Leave campaign was that it managed to pull off quite an interesting paradox. To say, on the one hand, leaving the EU will be a revolutionary moment in which all sorts of things will change for the better, but also that it would be an almost consequence-free action, that we could leave the EU and our trade relations would largely remain the same. And insofar as you believed that, it became possible, therefore, to vote on all sorts of other grounds. And I think the anti-establishment point you make is particularly interesting here. The Leave campaign was very successful at saying that we are an anti-elite, anti-establishment movement. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why we might be cynical about that. This is a campaign that was backed by the world's most powerful media magnate, by the owners of almost all the major media groups in Britain, that could draw on the resources of what was then the biggest financial donor in British history, that could command the services of people like Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage, that had the support of the Republican candidate for the President of the United States. This wasn't some kind of collection of horny-handed sons of soil. But the fact that that case resonated, I think does tell us something really important about British politics. And I remember doing educational events in the run up to the referendum, and these were not Remain or Leave events. They were simply meant to be helping voters understand the issues that were at stake or getting people in who could answer their questions about agricultural policy or whatever it was that they were interested in. And the firewall of hostility that came back, actually, towards anybody who was seen as an expert or an elite was really sobering. And actually, I think was another reason why academic historians needed to do a little bit of looking in the mirror after the polls had closed.
Yeah, I was lucky enough, as I said, when I was sitting in 11 Downing Street, I thought if the people out there could see us, we wouldn't be so comfortable and complacent with our drinks and our canapes. We would just be being shouted at. You mentioned earlier, I do think I need to raise it. You mentioned Jeremy Corbyn's role earlier. So this is, again, to go back to individuals, but also it relates to some of the things that we've discussed. Again, there's some feeling, not so much that Johnson won it, but that Corbyn lost it, in the sense that there is no question the leader of the Labour Party was the least enthusiastic establishment figure. He's not an establishment figure, which is why he was the least enthusiastic, but he was in an establishment role. He was leader of the opposition. Now, my sense of it is that it made almost no difference. The idea that if Jeremy Corbyn had been giving full-throated support to Remain on platforms that he was sharing with David Cameron and George Osborne, this would have swung those crucial couple of million votes that were needed to ensure that the Remain campaign won. I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a range of reasons, not least it's really hard to imagine that scenario. I picture Jeremy Corbyn standing on a platform with David Cameron and giving his full-throated support, and I just think, well, people would just laugh. But there is still a lingering sense that somehow in this story, because as you said, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the right-wing established press, people with a lot of money, the Republican candidate for president of the United States, if only the Labour Party, the party of the workers, had really thrown its weight behind the Remain campaign, it might have made a difference. I don't think so, but you can tell me I'm wrong.
I think Corbyn is probably mainly important as a kind of absence in the campaign. This is somebody who blazed across the campaign trail like a meteor in 2017 and reminded everyone of actually what a gifted campaigner he could be. Whereas in 2016, I think it would be fair to say that he was manifestly bored and disengaged. He had been a Eurosceptic for most of his career, but it had never really been one of his passions. In that sense, he wasn't Tony Benn. I think for Tony Benn, actually getting Britain out of Europe was, by the end of his career, the most important issue in his politics, whereas Corbyn's interests had always really lain in other issues and in other parts of the world. Now, it clearly matters that Britain's biggest pro-Remain party is effectively off the map in 2016, partly because that encourages the sense that David Cameron is the face of the Remain campaign, that you are voting for or against David Cameron. But I go back to the point that Corbyn doesn't drop out of a spaceship. In a sense, he is a symptom of a set of wider problems. Firstly, the fact that Britain's biggest pro-Remain party is willing to elect someone who isn't very interested in the European question tells us something about the strength of commitment on the Remain side. But secondly, it tells us something about the difficulty of imagining a kind of Corbynite campaign for membership. Corbyn's politics were anti-elite and anti-establishment. He wanted to be attacking political elites. He wanted to be attacking neoliberalism and markets. It's very difficult, therefore, for him to sound enthusiastic about an organisation that is in fact founded upon a market and that all elite institutions are telling you that you should be part of. And in that sense, he represented a kind of brand problem within the Remain cause rather than creating it.
We're going to go on and talk about what followed from this vote. And the second part of this conversation is going to take the story from 2016 through to now. But a couple more things just about the vote itself and its immediate consequences. As I said at the beginning, one of the difficulties of making sense of British politics at the moment is the creation through this referendum of these two tribes, who are still the tribes of British politics. No question, I think you can look at voting intentions across the parties. And also, just to take the Makerfield by-election as an example, when you divide it up left and right, you get very equal scores. There are all these new parties, but when you tot it up, Restore and Reform and the Conservatives on one side, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens on the other, it's a very 50-50 nation. It's very 50-50 in a lot of constituencies. And those groupings also conform to the Leave-Remain dynamic. Was it created in 2016? In the sense that did this referendum in building these two coalitions, 17.5 million, 16.5 million, bring into being something that didn't really exist before? Or is this more deeply structural than that in the sense that those coalitions were out there and this referendum is more symptom than cause of the way in which they have come now to organise British politics? For the reasons that we've discussed, there is the anti-elite, anti-establishment, left behind, feeling left out, but also a whole set of interests around immigration and other things on one side, and another set of interests on the other side that could relate to all sorts of questions, environmental questions. Environmental questions track quite neatly onto the Remain-Leave divide. Did 2016 create these tribes, or did it reveal these tribes?
There's a useful concept here, which is coined by a wonderfully named political scientist called E. Schatzschneider, which is called the mobilization of bias. And what he meant by that was that voting blocs don't just exist naturally in the electorate, but nor are they just conjured out of the air. What successful campaigns do is that they activate certain preferences, instincts, and biases, and they suppress others. And that might change between different kinds of election or different kinds of contest. So, for example, the level of education that somebody has, whether they leave school at the age of 16 or whether they have a graduate degree, that is one of the best predictors of voting intention in the referendum in 2016. It is almost completely useless as a predictor of voting intention in the general election of 2015. Social class was a much better indicator of voting intention in the general election than it was in the referendum. Now, those fault lines didn't appear or disappear over the winter of 2015 to 2016. You had political organisations and campaigns and questions that were lighting some of them up and suppressing others. And what I think the referendum does is that it establishes a nationwide election on an important question that happens outside the established party system. And that snaps allegiances that have been fraying for a very long time. It actually says to the public, go out and vote, but not for any of the big parties. Do something different. And then because the referendum doesn't close that question, but instead inflames it and makes it the biggest question for the next 3 years, those identities then harden, and all sorts of political actors have an interest in maintaining, building, and reinforcing those identities. So it's not inevitable that British politics comes to focus around those 2 points, but it's structurally very likely because of the conditions of that vote and its aftermath.
Just to say, there is one other measure that I think was a useful predictor, both of the 2015 general election and the 2016 Brexit referendum, and that was age. So not education, not class, but age, in the sense that in 2015, if you knew someone's age, you could tell, not with any certainty, but you could make a decent guess as to whether they were likely to have voted Conservative or Labour. And again, in the referendum, if you knew someone's age, you had a pretty good indicator of whether they were likely to have voted Leave or Remain. The older they were, the more likely they were both to vote Leave and to vote Conservative. And age is potentially, I think, in this, the central dynamic. We could maybe come back to that when we talk about the consequences of the vote. I've got one last question for you for this part of the conversation. It's a big question, so it may take a couple of stages to answer it. But we haven't addressed what the result of this referendum meant by way of, let's call it, an instruction to Britain's politicians. That is, there was a lot of discussion during the campaign. If you vote to leave, this will happen and that will happen. You'll get poorer, or you'll get more money for the NHS. There will be fewer immigrants. Don't believe that. There'll be more of this, there'll be less of that. Practical consequences, real world consequences. We'll leave and this will follow. But in some ways, the prior question was, if you vote to leave, you are saying something to your elected representatives about what you want them to do. You are not saying to them what kind of Brexit you want. You are not giving them an indication of the time frame in which you wish this to happen. You're not telling them how you want them to negotiate. You are simply saying you wish them to leave the European Union. And you are giving that demonstration of your preference within a system within which it is your parliamentary representatives who will have to decide. And a referendum is a very different form of politics than a general election to a parliament. And it would be the parliament that was elected in 2015 that would have to act on the referendum of 2016. Not the Prime Minister, because he quit the next morning, but it would be a Conservative Prime Minister because there was a Conservative majority in Parliament. Just how unclear was the nature of the instruction? Was it even an instruction? It wasn't just a indication. It clearly had a lot more political force than that. It wasn't just advisory. But did anyone really know what it meant?
Well, firstly, I think we have to say that it was an instruction. It did become fashionable in some circles to say afterwards that it was only an advisory referendum. But the government had said that it would enact the result. All the major parties had said that they would enact the result. And I think there would have been an earthquake if there had been any attempt by MPs to say, well, the country's voted to leave, but it was only an opinion poll. So I think it was an instruction. The problem is that that instruction was incomplete. It did not give any instruction on the terms on which Britain should leave, the timing under which Britain should leave, the kind of future relationship that it might negotiate. And because all forms of Brexit were less popular than Brexit in the abstract, because they all involved some kind of trade-off or some kind of compromise, that meant that there was a mandate for leaving, but there wasn't a mandate for any of the specific doors through which Britain might actually depart. Those questions still had to be answered, in the sense they became the most pressing questions of British politics after 2016. But the referendum also disabled the right of MPs to make those decisions. If we think about conventional democratic theory, the right of an MP to make decisions classically comes from the fact that they have won an election in their constituency. But in the referendum, 3/4 of MPs had been on the losing side. Something like 60% of them had voted differently to their own constituents. So there was a sense that MPs had only a kind of tempered sovereignty on those questions, that they were enacting an instruction that they themselves would not have given, and it was unclear whether they really had the democratic right to decide on things like the customs union, the single market, or the timing of Article 50.
We're going to go on and talk about what followed from that, but just to ask you the question bluntly, the tension between this form of politics, referendum politics, sometimes called plebiscitary politics, which is you put a question directly to the people and you get a direct answer, and parliamentary representative politics, in which you elect people to a legislature to take decisions on your behalf and then you're able to judge how you feel about that periodically. Did the collision between these two things inevitably lead to a crisis of British democratic politics, a crisis of legitimacy in a sense?
I don't think it's inevitable. There are parliamentary systems that use referendums without blowing their institutions to pieces. I think the problem is that we didn't do any serious thinking about how to bring these two things together. Most referendums in British history have been confirmatory. So Parliament has done something and then it asks the public whether they assent to that. And that's reasonably easy for a parliamentary system to handle, because what Parliament has decided either goes ahead or is simply stopped. What we had here was what we might call an abdicatory referendum. Parliament abdicated any right to make the decision on membership. It didn't even vote on or debate the question of whether Britain should stay in. And it created a fundamental problem, as we've discussed, of legitimacy, but also of the kind of delivery system for making decisions. Because the referendum required Parliament to do something almost unprecedented. It had to carry through an absolutely planetary-sized reform, one of the biggest things any British government has done in peacetime, through a Parliament in which no party had a working majority. That was true even before the 2017 election. It was magnified by the outcome of that election.
But the Tories did have a working majority before 2017. You think it was too small?
Yes, I mean, by a working majority, we mean a majority large enough to get your legislation through reasonably reliably. So yes, the Conservatives had a formal majority after the 2015 election, but it was never going to be big enough to get through hugely contentious legislation. Now, normally when you're in that situation, governments don't do big controversial things because there's no point starting a fight that you can't win. Most of the time, of course, parties have large majorities so they can dominate Parliament. So this specific scenario in which you have major reform that must be carried through and a Parliament that has no party majority is almost unique. Now, you could have resolved that by trying to work across the party divide. But Britain doesn't really have much tradition of that, and the two leaders at this point in time were particularly tribal, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. There's a wonderful moment that illustrates this, I think, in 2018, when Martin Zellmeyer, who was chief of staff to the president of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, is astonished to discover that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have Theresa May's phone number. And Jeremy Corbyn is equally astonished at the idea that he would ever want to call her. And it's one of those moments where you see two different political cultures simply gaping at one another in incomprehension.
That was the first part of this conversation. The second part is coming out tomorrow on PPF+. In it, Robert and I take the story from 2016 up to the present. We try to make sense of the twists and turns along the way, but also to decide whether the state of British politics today is to be explained by what happened in June 2016. Is it still all about Brexit? If you would like to hear that episode, all you have to do is sign up now for PPF+. Click on the link in our show description or go to our website ppfideas.com. You will get immediate access to our archive of more than 50 bonus episodes, and you'll be signing up to 2 new bonus episodes every month, plus ad-free listening and automatic sign-up to our fortnightly newsletter. It costs £5 a month or £50 for the year. That is what it has always cost. We haven't put the price up over the last couple of years. Next time in our regular slot, it's the last in our series of live episodes recorded at the Regent Street Cinema in London. In this one, I'm talking to the geneticist, science writer and PPF regular Adam Rutherford about the film of Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, Never Let Me Go. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.